Greetings, MMORPG fans, and welcome to this episode of MMONFT, which is actually a two-part episode showcasing the one and only Ember Sword. Why is it two parts, you ask? Because we try and keep our episodes to a maximum of about 20 minutes, and we have so much information from our interview with executive producer Loren Roosendaal, we had to split it into two separate episodes. In this spotlight of Ember Sword, we're going to be touching on all things game related. That means a little less NFT talk and more about the world, the lore, the gameplay, the endgame, and more. We also have some gameplay that you haven't seen before and some of Ember Sword's trailers sprinkled throughout each episode, so you'll definitely want to check them both out to make sure you don't miss anything. As always, if you're enjoying our limited run of MMONFT and you'd like to see more, hit that like and subscribe button. Now let's get started with part 1, which will cover the world and lore of Ember Sword, and also some of the PvE and PvP aspects of the game.
I'm Loren Roosendaal. I am one of the founders of Star Studios, which is building Ember Sword, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that runs in your browser in a couple of seconds, but can also be played on PC, Mac, etc., even on console, hopefully in the future, that uses blockchain technology to do some really cool stuff on top of all of that. And as a founder and particularly as an executive producer, I spend most of my time at Ember Sword on the product.
And so today we're here to talk specifically about the gameplay of Ember Sword. So let's start by just simply defining what kind of game Ember Sword is.
Yeah, so we started obviously with the notion of Ember Sword is an MMORPG. And, it is a particular kind of an MMORPG in the sense that it leans more towards the sandbox end of the MMORPG spectrum. And also it's not class-based, but rather skill-based. So that puts it more into categories like a RuneScape, the sandbox, and an Albion Online, for example. While it does have deep lore and awesome questing, etc., which has a bit of a flavor of the World of Warcraft-esque nature to it, in and of itself, as if you look at the gameplay, it's really a case of, if you want to go adventuring, go pick up a sword, walk into the bushes, fight creatures, go questing, do amazing stuff, and you'll get better at it as you go. And if tomorrow you decide that you want to actually focus on fishing, get a rod, find some water, go nuts, right? And you will grow in what you're doing as you play. And then, the other important question is, of course, with any MMO, what's the gameplay then like in terms of, for example, combat mechanics, right? How does that feel? And this is also a place where Ember Sword is quite interesting because although it is an MMO, it plays much more like a sort of a MOBA meets an ARPG. Right, so there's a lot more sort of Twitch-like mechanics to it. There's a fair bit more player skill, and it's this combination of sort of a more real-time hack and slash type combat feel.
Ember Sword takes place in a dystopian universe, so something has happened along the way. Something has happened before players get into the game that leads to where they are when they first join. So what exactly is the point that players are coming into the game? Like, what has happened up to that point?
Right. Well, I'm not sure if we've disclosed everything that sort of happened up to that point yet. I think it's part of the mystery. There's a lot of depth there, and obviously I am not the lore master of this game. We have someone really great who's got Hollywood screenwriting background, who's doing all this in-depth lore around what we're doing. We find ourselves on Thanabus, this what is essentially a moon, right, with 4 particular regions where dystopian is maybe a term that would kind of give people a bit the wrong idea. It's comparatively still a relatively light-hearted and friendly-looking game, despite these sort of, semi-dystopian themes that have more to do with, sort of humanity coming down from a phase where they were technologically much farther advanced. And that has kind of all fallen apart. And you go into the landscape and you see sort of these traces of that, like, broken down robots flying around. And even in the technology in the game, right, you have this, you always have this trade of like, is there magic in the game? No, it's not quite magic, but in the case of Ember Sword, for example, the element of magic is much more like, any sufficiently advanced technology for, let's say a less advanced species will be essentially comparable to magic. We've got this flux energy that admittedly is not really understood by the people living there, and you've got these remnants of the past that aren't fully understood and could become active at any time and lead to some really interesting adventure. And then you've got the player base trying to sort of find their way through that and unravel almost as they go the history of what has come before, and then help shape the future of what will come after.
For those of us who have been paying attention to the world design in Ember Sword, a lot of what we've seen from Solarwood has been like these brick roads, some stylized forests, complete with like these really manicured boxwood bushes and these modern homes that are also mixed with like some castles and like some futuristic structures. And, are we going to see a variety to the landscape in Solarwood, or is it something that you're going to see more like in new nations as they're created?
Indeed, what you've seen is obviously it's the Solarwood portion of it. Now, obviously, even within Solarwood, there's quite some depth in terms of differing themes, from like farmland strewn with, wheat being ready to be harvested and windmills standing around, right, in certain areas, to, open grassland and forests. Generally, Solarwood has a particular theme, right? It's solar and wood. I mean, the name kind of says it already, right? So that's one of the cool things I think about this world we're building. Solarwood certainly has some level of identity because we're doing sort of this iterative early access type of development. Once the world opens up to people, it'll just still be a portion of Solarwood, and then it'll expand from there. We have some of these unique dungeons that are, for example, underneath the capital of Solarwood, where some experiments have gone on that are maybe not quite as lighthearted as the rest of the atmosphere of Solarwood is. And you're going to delve in there and find out what happened, and find out there is this layer of, what happens when academics go wrong and when people do experiments that maybe ethically are not right. So there's definitely stuff to be discovered in the deeper layers there. But then when you go on to Duscaron and Severant and Edisol, these are all drastically different landscapes. You could almost say, as different as the seasons. And if you look at Edisol, for example, it once was a forest, and then there was a catastrophe, right? Again, more details to be found out by the players. But essentially, it's now a giant snowy frontier covered with icy tundra and high mountains. So, it's like stepping into a whole different climate. And there's also transitional zones, of course, between these, but that gives each of these parts of the world their unique color, their unique adventures to be had, their unique wildlife, flora, fauna, even some unique resources that are just a little bit better in one of the other nations. We've got Severant, which is much more jungles, and we've got Duscaron, which is more of a dry, arid desert land with the type of living that you would expect in a desert. And so all of these regions essentially have their own color, theme, lore, characters, and we just kind of wanted to make this something where you figure you might spend a lot of time in Solarwood. At some point you decide, well, you're up for a bit of a new experience. You can just have a whole new region to go into and explore and adventure into. Plus, in addition, some level of trading and such between these regions that can be very interesting for the players due to resource differences and such.
One big driver of Ember Sword is that it's a community-driven game, right? So sometimes when people hear that, they think very little story content. Are we going to see quests and an underlying story like more traditional MMORPGs?
Yeah, so the way we approach it is kind of multi-layered, right? So initially, as we start rolling the game out, there's already going to be some elements of adventure, but they're going to be still relatively lightweight because by its nature, it's more of a sandbox-esque game, right? So our first concern is that you can kind of create the adventure for yourself, if you will, by going out there and experiencing certain things. And so there we also lean a little bit on procedural generation of things and even some AI to create interesting quest-like experiences. Now, when you talk about it's a community-driven game, that's also largely because it's the community that owns cities, settlements, towns, etc. Right? So in that sense, yeah, it's the community that's deciding which facilities are where, and they're kind of balancing it out based on the surrounding world of Ember Sword. But it's that surrounding world where we can play with all the interesting quest lines and unique adventures that span throughout the entire regions, right? So in the end, what we're expecting to bring, although of course it will be sort of drip fed to players over time, we expect to unlock more and more also storyline based quests and even raids and things like that advance that whole that whole story of Ember Sword.
The game plans to cater to both the PvE players, right, and then also PvP players. So let's talk a little bit about how combat and progression is going to work in this game. So for people who are just getting their first glimpse at Ember Sword in this video and its combat in general, the game takes place it's an isometric world where it has that, RuneScape, Albion, like maybe with the art style, a little bit of a torchlight feel to it. And we've seen, some positional attacks and some highly mobile attacks, but the game is also classless, right? So are the skills that you learn based specifically around the weapons that you equip?
That's an important one, right? Because when it comes to, being in the thick of it, sometimes role definition is very important for fun gameplay, right? You need to kind of know, like, okay, when we're going into this dungeon together, right? Who is going to be doing roughly what. So the way that works is there's actually segments of gameplay where you likely will not even be able to change the particular gear you've got equipped, right? So you might go into a dungeon raid and you might indeed pull out, you might pull out your sword and shield, someone else might pull out their bow and arrow, someone else might be, brandishing this power fist-like construction that also wields flux to kind of do something akin to spell casting almost, right? And then together you're a strong team. One is buffing, healing, the other is getting up close and tanking, another one is executing carefully planned ranged attacks, etc. Right? The skills and abilities that you will deploy are indeed tied to the gear that you've got equipped. So by taking that sword out, now suddenly you've got access to the whole range of abilities that you've unlocked on your sword progression, right? And so that's what you're now playing with. And so that's how we maintain sort of the ability to adopt a role and have an understanding of what everyone is going to be doing, while at the same time making it so that the next dungeon you can go into, you can just swap roles and go like, yeah, now I'm going to be the support, or now I'm going to be the ranged warrior, or et cetera, et cetera.
If you're in a game about to go into a dungeon and you see somebody holding a two-handed sword, then you basically kind of know what their skill set is, or is it going to be a situation where there's also talent trees based on the weapons that you choose, so you can kind of change up your spec a little bit?
This is probably reaching into something that we've not had enough time to explore to really tell which bend of the road we're taking there. I think we're going to start off relatively simple and then sort of see if we can tier on bits of complexity as is needed and makes sense for the game. But I would say, generally speaking, we'll be striving to visually communicate, even if there were some way to spec into it, right? To visually communicate some semblance of what can I expect this character to do.
How many skills are going to be available per weapon? Do you know? Do you have like an idea of how many skills you want to put on the hotbar at a single time?
I wouldn't say we're 100% there yet, but like in some of the current things we're doing, we have sort of a progression where it's abilities, right, basically that unlock, because the skill is, let's say, one-handed sword combat or two-handed or whatever, or something like that, right? And then there's a skill progression. Think of it sort of as a winding road of skills that you pick of abilities that you pick up as your skill progresses from, like, let's say 0 to 100, right? Which along that way, you're both finding new things that you may not have unlocked yet, but you're also finding next iterations, next levels of things that you already unlocked. So, let's say, I'm going to say something very, very basic, but let's say you have a shield bash or something, right? The first iteration of a shield bash would be something that unlocks quite early, but by the time you get to the final iteration of that shield bash, in terms of the impact and capability of that ability, it's going to be a huge difference. So that's one way that we're progressing. And then there's, the amount of skills. And currently, I think we're floating somewhere around, like in our current test, we're not trying to be too wild. So it's 4, 5, maybe 6 particular core. So it's a bit more mobile, like in terms of the amount of them. And there's maybe a bit more focus on the interplay of them, right? Where by layering them properly, timing them properly, and timing them along with your teammates, amazing effects will occur, right?
Are there more spots, or is there a place for consumables or healing or mana potions or whatever you have? Are consumables going to be important to gameplay, and should this be a warning that players should be hoarding their consumables, save them for the big moments?
Yeah, so admittedly, we have not settled on a final decision there, but I would say that certainly we like the notion of, especially when you have some room left, obviously, on that whole notion of a hotbar, to bring consumables into the mix as an interesting way to augment what you're doing with your character, right? Not just maybe even purely, here, I'm going to chuck down a health potion, right? But you could imagine that there might be some little interesting, let's say, consumable pseudo abilities that could be really interesting to deploy.
Will we have specific, I guess, weapons that are more self-sufficient than others, or is it going to be a situation where you always have to think of going into an encounter with other players?
Well, I think there's always some level of self-sufficiency, obviously, because you don't want to completely take out of the equation solo play. Sort of this notion of playing alone together can be fun and even important, especially if you don't have too much time to toss into a particular session. Just want to go in there, have a little bit of fun, and maybe don't go like on a full-fledged adventure with 5 people or even half a guild into, some massive dungeon raid or so. So there's definitely some level of self-sufficiency. I would also point towards this notion that there is obviously some level of archetyping between the different types of weapons, where, one particular type might give you an advantage on a player equipped with another one, and similarly so through the cycle, kind of like a rock, paper, scissors kind of effect to it, right? Without making it too heavy. Like thinking in terms of, if I took an RTS term to it, soft counters. Right? It's not quite a hard counter. It's not like, shit, the guy's got a sword, I'm doomed now, right? But, the guy's got a sword. Well, I'd better outskill him pretty decently, otherwise I might be in trouble, right? For a game like this, there's a lot of wealth in the data, right? So we're going to be collecting a lot of data on how people are experiencing the game, and that will also give us some really clear statistics as to how is this unpacking this experience, right? When we think that, like, a someone with a sword might be at a 10% disadvantage against someone with a bow, right? The reality is data can tell you whether or not that's actually making any sense, right? And whether that's making sense for a beginning player, someone who's more in the middle of the MRR ratings, if you will, right? And someone who's peak competitive play. So we're hoping to put a lot of data to use when it comes to the balancing of things in order to make sure that we kind of have that dynamic going on in a fun and interesting way. We're not afraid to tweak things to make for a great experience, right? So, and we're still going to have to do that. I mean, we're in the next year bringing an open sort of alpha to the people who bought land and badges and so on, right? So that's very early access we're giving people. So obviously things are going to be changed around.
Thank you all for watching part 1 of our interview with Ember Sword executive producer Loren Roosendaal. Head on over to part 2 to hear about itemization and the big one, endgame.